Good morning. My name is Bill Rodgers. Today is April 26, 2018. We're at the Museum of Chincoteague Island. We're going to interview Earlene Watson Young and have her tell us about the founding of this great museum. First of all, Earlene, would you give a little background as to who you are, where you were born?
I'm Earlene Young, Earlene Watson Young. I was born in Salisbury, Maryland, which was the nearest hospital, but I came back home to Chincoteague. That's the first place my feet touched the ground. Chincoteague's always been home. I regret that I'm not here now, but it just didn't seem possible at this stage in life. And I was born on March the 23rd, 1932. So I'm getting to be an old lady. It's been a wonderful life, and growing up at Chincoteague is probably my most cherished memories, that other than seeing my children grow and have families. My parents were Elodie Booth Watson and Earl Voker Watson. And his parents were William Watson, and I can't remember her maiden name. I'm sorry, last name was Gordy, but I can't remember her first name. And they lived on the corner of Clark Street. And William Watson was very active in the seafood industry, and he also was one of the first councilmen on the island. He had quite a large family. My grandfather, Elmer, was his first child by his first wife, and then later he remarried and had several children. Each one of them he gave a lot on Clark Street, one being Miss Laura Clark, or Laura Watson Clark, and the name became Clark Street because of that family. I'm trying to think what else Bill would like to know. I know that my grandfather, well, they all were very interested in progress. And my great-great-grandparents evidently lived on Ocean Boulevard. And my grandfather told me that he used to go to his grandmother's and brush her sand floor. And eventually that house was gone. Grandfather owned all of Ocean Boulevard, and he developed it. He said he went in and cut down a lot of the trees on his own, and he wanted to make it a gateway to Assateague. My grandmother was Zipporah Hill, and she owned property on Piney Island and also on Assateague. So his dream was to carry it straight on through. He laid out the Ocean Boulevard to match some of the avenues he'd seen in Atlantic City where he used to go as a boy. And he wanted an avenue of trees down the center. And that's why you'll see that road is wider than most of the roads. Unfortunately, he was not able to fulfill his dream, but Mr. Wild Maddox came along later, put the road to Assateague through his property, which was good and advantage financially. But the nice thing that Mr. Wild Maddox did was go get my grandfather, who was then in his 90s, and take him across the bridge as one of the first people to go to Assateague. So he was able to see his dream come true. Granddaddy had a very interesting life. He was a good man. He was a marvelous athlete, as was my father. He was in the seafood business, which he started early with his father, became acquainted with it early with his father. And he had a fish camp down on the dock in back of what later became the restaurant, the Landmark restaurant. And I think he had something like 7 boats. He had done extremely well with the oyster industry, and he used to do barrel oysters. He transplanted 1,000 bushels of oysters every year. Can you imagine having that many oysters when you look at today?
Really?
And then he made them what they called barrel stuff, because they were single, and sent them to bookbinders in Philadelphia, and Diamond Jim Brady, and so quite a history. And he used to load 2 boxcars of fish.
Was a big restaurant in Philadelphia.
It was
I used to
famous.
eat in that
It was
restaurant.
And
famous.
all they said,
Okay.
they didn't call them oysters, they just called them Chincoteagues.
Oh, well, I was in
They're
Alexandria.
eating Chincoteagues.
I was in Alexandria at Christmas time, and the man says, "I can recommend our Chincoteague oysters."
Open again.
And I said, "Are you sure they came from Chincoteague?" I can tell. Then he became involved in the fish business, which eventually was his undoing. You can start a business and it doesn't make it. And he was determined he was going to make it, so he stayed in it longer than he should have. So he didn't get to realize his dream going to Assateague, but Mr. Maddox did, and he was able to see it. My father used to tell me about Granddaddy caught a sturgeon one time, and there was so much caviar in it that they got $500 for that sturgeon, and that must have been back at the turn of the 19th century. And Daddy said all that sturgeon roe, and it was in buckets, and he would put his hands all in it. So it was an interesting life, a lot of history. Granddaddy was on the directors that put the bridge across to Chincoteague, so he did a great deal. And Mother, of course, came from a family that was very active, and that's how I related to Bill. When she was a senior in high school, there was a telephone office on Chincoteague, but at that time, they were not company offices, they were agency offices. And much like a McDonald's and a franchise, they sublet it to different people. And Mother's aunt, who was Bessie Connor, had run the telephone office from her home, but her husband was in the Coast Guard and they were transferred. She recommended that my mother take over the office. Well, Mother was just a senior in high school, but evidently the people were pleased with her, so she took the job, which she kept for 35 years. She located the office in her mother's home, which was on Main Street. It's now where the post office is. She worked nights, and she said she conjugated her Latin verbs on her sleeves, trying to stay awake. And then she would go to school during the day, and she graduated second or third in her class, went to school, made more money than the school teachers, and came out with a profession. Her family wanted her to go on to college, but she opted to have her brother go because she knew that she had a profession or a job that she could continue to work. And also, the telephone company rented a room for my grandmother's house, so that was very good for them economically. Grandmother, there's a Red Men's Hall, you've probably seen pictures of it, and it was in her front yard, and oh, she did not like it at all. It's right where the post office is, but the house stood about where the post office is, and the Red Men's Hall was right out on the sidewalk. It was a beautiful building. It was beautifully built with a mansard roof, 2 or 3 story. I remember marble floors. It was really something. But Grandmother scraped and saved till she could buy enough money to buy that Red Men's Hall and have it demolished.
This is after the Red Men had gone
They
defunct.
had abandoned it, yes. And
Yeah.
so she had all their costumes, and Bill remembers seeing pictures of us dressed up in the Indian costumes with all the feathers. We had a wonderful time. I wish I still had some of them. They would have been great for this museum. So let's see, what else can I tell you?
Didn't you work as at the telephone office?
Yes. Mother's kept the office. She was she had the agency. She hired the girls, and of course all the young girls loved to work for the telephone company. It was a good salary, it was clean work. And nights or days after school, the school was over on Church Street, so I could just cut through to Main Street and go by and see them. And so I cut my teeth on a switchboard. So I know some of the girls would say, "Miss Elodie, I have a date with Sunday afternoon. Can't Earlene work for me?" I probably was no more than 13, but I'd run that switchboard on Sunday afternoons when it was slow, all by myself. Of course, Mother was home. I could call her if I had a problem. And the funny thing was, there was a box in there. It was an alarm. If we had a fire, people would call, and the switchboard, there's one in the Smithsonian. My grandchildren think it's hilarious. But little buttons would drop down, and you'd stick a plug in a hole, and you'd open a cam and say, "Operator." Well, when the fire alarm would go off, and a lot of times we had to set it off ourselves, people would call and say, "Operator, there's a fire at Charlie Gall's store." Well, immediately you'd pull the alarm. The next thing you knew, every button on that board would fall down, and all I would do is take all the plugs and plug them in and say, "Charlie Gall's store, Charlie Gall's store, Charlie Gall's store." So, but it was fun, and it was a wonderful way to grow up, and I always had money. And the girls would say, "I've got a date, let Earlene work," but it was good. And Mother, had it for 35 years. She, I know when they went dial, it went company, and that meant that all the operators no longer had work. I think she had maybe 15 or 20 operators at that time. But I remember driving her around the island to go to all the homes of the older people because she was so afraid they wouldn't know how to use a dial telephone, to teach them at least how to dial for an emergency. And she had her first heart attack at that time. But again, my mother was an entrepreneur. She flew in old Cessna airplane back in the 20s. She was the first woman on Chincoteague to have her own car. She said she drove it down Main Street and drove it up on the bank steps, which was the bank on the corner of Church Street, and all the men scattered. She was in charge of the Red Cross. She was in charge of welfare. She was in charge of so much. I don't know how she did it, but she always thought you should give back. So I guess that's how I got initiated.
And what about your father and the tomato factory?
Oh my goodness, Daddy was the entrepreneur. And he could afford to be because Mother had stability. But he started the first dressed poultry plant on Chincoteague. Bill didn't know they had that. It was down on the dock, and I call everything the dock, but it's now where the Comfort Inn is, or in that area. And I remember he had the chickens, and they would send them through, and they would slit their throats, and then they would dip them in hot water, and they'd pluck the feathers, and then they'd push them on up, and they would weigh them and put them in big barrels that were wine casks with ice, and they were shipped whole. They didn't dress them. But that lasted a number of years. Of course, then I imagine the poultry industry became more prominent, and then there was no Purdue or Holly Farms or any of that at that time. And so then after that closed, he became involved in the tomato factory, tomato cannery, and that had belonged to my mother's cousin's husband, and he bought that. Unfortunately, just as it was getting off the ground, it had an explosion. Evidently, I remember I lived on Clark Street, and the tomato cannery was down off Main Street. I'm trying to think in what location. Where was it?
Down by not far from the Coast Guard station,
Right,
behind Conant's hardware store.
Right, just about by the Coast Guard station. And I remember that the shot was so great it knocked me out of bed on Clark Street. What had happened is the two men that were responsible for starting the furnace, or the heat, I guess, that they had to have in
The
order
boilers.
the boilers, poured cold water on the hot boiler, and it exploded. As it was, the bus driver overslept that morning. None of the workers were there. There were a lot of things that happened that it just made it seem so strange that no one was, well, the two men were killed, but other than that, there were no other injuries. He did not rebuild it. And then he left and retired and went to Florida. Then my husband and I bought the family home and lived in Chincoteague for a number of years. School days?
School days.
School days. Okay, let's see. Well, first grade was in the building that's now your community center, did you say?
Yes.
Chincoteague Cultural Alliance.
Yes.
Or it was a long white building. And the two first grades were in there. And I remember Marguerite Hickman was my first grade school teacher. And my last name was Watson, so I was the last one on the roll to be called just about. And everybody had such pretty names, like Janet Lee, Mary Lou, and I was just Earlene Watson. Never thought it was a very pretty name. My parents had been married 10 years when they were finally able to have me, and they were thrilled. Mother was in the hospital in Salisbury. They would not release you until you named the baby. She didn't have a name for me. My grandmother, again, these women were strong women, I told you that earlier, said, for heaven's sakes, you've had 10 years to think about it. Name her and let's go home. Mother said, but I thought she'd be a boy. Grandmother said, and I'd name her Earl for her father. My grandmother said, name her Earlene and take her home. So I remember being in first grade. I'm so embarrassed. Earlene Watson. What a bland name. But I had Princess Margaret Rose and Princess Elizabeth paper dolls. So when she got to me and she said, your full name, please. I said, Earlene Rose Watson. Well, I carried that name all through school. And my family was not happy when it was read out at graduation.
And it wasn't your name?
No, it wasn't my name. But I was going to have a fancy name. Anyway, that was first grade. It was great. I remember our rhythm band, and we wore gold and navy blue. And it was quite a busy little rhythm band. We played sticks and blocks and whatever, but we made a lot of noise. Then second grade was an advancement. We went across to what we called the White Building, which was an old frame building in back of the current, or what was the brick building. And I was there through the 5th grade. And then we went over to the brick building. And then you had your junior high school on the ground level, and then you advanced to high school by going upstairs. The 12th grade was added, and I caught it the 12th year, so I went away to finish high school. And that was the end of that. But I was editor of the school paper. We had a nice paper called the Chinky News. We sold ads, and we had an old mimeograph machine, and we'd go in the balcony and crank it out. Nothing fancy, but we had a lot of fun. Had a nice Girl Scout troop. I remember Eula Gillis had the Girl Scout troop, and we had an old log building in back of what is now the Civic Center or your community center. And it had a fireplace, and we used to have our meetings back there. But that's long since gone.
I think that old log building turned into a coal storage at
Oh,
one.
really?
Yes.
Okay, so
when they
have
got the furnace there and the brick building.
right. So you have more
They
than
had central heat.
central heat. And when we were in the white building, we had to go out, and all the other buildings, we had to go over to the brick building to use the bathroom. Rain, snow, or what. And there was no such thing as a cafeteria. We went across to Twilly's store, and if we had enough money, we'd get a sandwich, and I got what Bill calls a square sandwich, square ham, but
Square meat.
square meat. I called it spice ham. Anyway, a ham sandwich and a sour pickle. And I was in New York a few years ago, and down off, I'm trying to think what street, there was a movie, The Pickle Man. And we went by it, and they had big barrels of pickles, and the kids all wanted ice cream cones, and I said, I want a sour pickle. It was those memories from Twilly's store. It was a wonderful place to grow up.
And tell us some of your teachers. Who were the teachers when you were in?
Marguerite Hickman, I'll never forget. She was a first grade school teacher. She came from the mainland, Hickman Farm, but she was a delightful teacher. Second grade was Janelle Mead, who became Janelle Jester, and she was very good. And I remember carving polar bears out of ivory soap. And Bob Mears' sister, not Elsie, but the younger one, Margaret Mears. She was my third grade teacher. And I loved Margaret. She taught me to read, to enjoy reading and to memorizing poetry. And we'd save jars and we'd paint those and make vases out of them, and then we'd have a sale. And so that started entrepreneurship at an early age. Fourth grade, one teacher I will never forget, and I owe her so much, was Miss Bertie Idlet. She was she was never married, I don't think. She lived on South Main Street down near Dickie Conklin's home. Miss Bertie was a wonderful teacher, and she so enjoyed reading. And I was reading a book a day. I still do pretty much of that, but I thank Miss Bertie for all of that.
She taught my father,
Did she really?
and I had her for first grade.
Wasn't she wonderful?
Yes, and you don't forget people
You don't.
like that.
I think she was probably one of my most remarkable teachers. And Betty Bell Matthews in high school. Betty Bell could be a little sharp-tongued. She was an old maid, but she was very smart. And she kept me in. Well, I know we went to New York, the Tri-High-Y group, which was a club in the school. And she took me to the Metropolitan Museum. And so I fell in love with it. And she was a very creative person. She wanted to reach beyond the norm. So I learned a great deal from Betty Bell.
And she was still there when
And you had her too?
12th grade.
She was a good teacher, but she could be very caustic.
Now you mentioned Mrs. Gillis was your Girl Scout troop leader, and when I was a little girl, I feared Mrs. Gillis.
Did you really? Well, I can understand why. But she was a good Girl Scout leader, and I learned a great deal under her.
Good. And she was a school teacher at that time too?
I think she was. And then later, when I came back to Chincoteague after finishing school and being a young bride, I started a brownie troop. So I can thank Eula for that, getting me involved in Scouts.
And where did you go away to school?
Bob Jones University, Bob Jones Academy.
And what did you study?
Speech and English.
I'm not surprised.
But you never taught.
No.
No.
Well, I did some tutoring and some substitute teaching, but no, I had a busy family.
Yeah, Frank kept you away from that.
It kept me involved.
Okay, we're going to talk about some of the school teachers that you had. You talked to us before about teachers you had when you were a little girl. Now we want to go into some of the teachers such as Betty Bell Matthews and Christine Conklin, who always makes us laugh a little bit at just the memory of her. Just kind of touch base on some of those teachers you had and how they influenced your life.
Well, Betty Bell taught me a great deal to reach beyond the normal. As I said, she could be very sharp-tongued. You knew when you displeased her, and you tried to please her as best you could. But I learned a great deal from her, I really did.
Did you have Miss Tillman?
I don't think I had Miss Tillman. I don't think I ever did. I didn't finish my high school here, if you remember.
That's,
There was a man, I'm trying to think of his name, he taught Latin. I had 2 years of Latin and 1 year of French under him, I think, because they don't even teach Latin anymore. And I think if I had to go back and look at anything that I learned as far as language was concerned, Latin was probably the best thing I could have ever had as far as my English, my understanding, the derivatives. It was just very, very good. He had taught in a boys' school out in the western part of the state somewhere. I really liked him. He lived at the Channel Bass Hotel. A lot of the teachers lived at the Channel Bass, Mr. John Winder. And, but he was a nice man, and I do know he taught French and Latin. I'm trying to think science was sadly lacking, or maybe it was me, but I just didn't seem to learn much in the way of science.
I know when I was there, science was taught by the football coach.
Oh my.
So,
Okay.
and we didn't get much science either.
No. And math, evidently, some people did. Look at how, well, of course he went away to school, but look how Fred did. Fred was a wonderful mathematician, Fred Talbert. I didn't feel like I got a very good math background. I know we had a young teacher that his husband was at Wallops Island, and she had been in industry, and evidently she was quite bright, but she was not a teacher. So my math, I can still do simple math, but don't give me a trig. I don't know why I like trig, but I do. It made sense. And geometry made more sense, but algebra never made any sense. I don't like the unknown. English, and I think most students that came from Chincoteague High School that went on or went away or went on to school did very, very well in English and history. But I think the sciences and math were lacking for the most part at that time. I don't remember having chemistry.
What are some of the other teachers?
Well, we said Iona Connor,
But I didn't have Iona.
and who did you say, Ann? You brought in a name there.
Catherine Reed, but she didn't
I didn't have
her
Catherine
either.
Reed, and then Catherine taught elementary school,
Yeah.
2nd grade, I think.
I had her in 5th grade.
And Elsie Mears taught 5th grade.
Well, you're right.
And Lula Wimbrow, did you have her anywhere?
Oh, I had Miss Lula, yes, I loved her. Loved her.
You are right. Catherine taught 2nd grade, I think, and I had Elsie.
Mm-hmm.
They moved them around every year. it
Well, they
seemed
didn't hurt
like.
anything. Could give you a change.
Elsie was a very interesting lady.
She was a very reserved lady.
Yes, she was.
And I don't know that she was as understanding of people and their backgrounds as she could have been,
You have a great memory.
unfortunately.
How about,
An elephant.
you said,
I never forget anything that was an injustice.
you said something the other day about Tommy Phillips.
Tommy Phillips. Tommy came back out of the service. He'd married, I thought she was French. I was telling Bill that the other day. And they lived in the old Wheelton house, had a small apartment. And she'd
the
had a
house.
son prior to her marriage to Tommy. I think it was Jean Valjean. I don't know if it was, I remember it was Valjean,
Jean.
I think it was. Wasn't it
Jean.
Valjean?
Something other Jean.
Anyway, Tommy was nice looking. He had written a textbook, I think, on English. He was very smart, but he put the fear of God in all of us. And I remember sitting in the classroom, and he asked us to conjugate the verb to be. And the told this girl, says, "What's wrong with you? Don't you have sense enough to do that?" Or something to that effect. And he said, "Isn't anyone in here, don't you know enough to conjugate the verb to be?" And I looked at him, and I was angry because he belittled everyone. I looked at him and I said, "I be, you be, he bees." I jumped up, ran out of that room, ran down to Nelson Jester's office, who was in the principal. And I said, "I'm never going back in that class again." But I did, and I became very fond of Tommy Phillips. Later on, I think he was principal at
He
Chincoteague
came
High
back
School.
and was
Yes.
the principal at
And
Chincoteague.
Heather
For a
had-
long while.
Heather had him as principal, but he was so intimidating. And of course, he was right out of the service, and he just was going to whip us into shape. And I wasn't going to be in shape. But I remember
The other
Tom
principal was Nelson Jester,
Nelson, and I think
and Carrie,
Bill Carey was
Bill Carey.
principal. I didn't have Nelson as principal. Nelson liked music, and I play the piano terribly, but I learned how to play Juanita, and it was his favorite song. And they lived next door, and whenever I'd see him out on the porch, I'd play Juanita. Bill Carey was great. He was fun-loving. He always had his door open. All the boys related very well
He was
to
a
him.
very gentle
A nice,
man,
nice
as
man.
I remember
recall.
when we heard he was leaving.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was only maybe first, second grade, very young. And all of us little girls were just in tears.
I'm sure,
Because
I'm
we
sure.
didn't want him to leave.
I was
And
And
then
very,
we
later
went
came
up to
back.
his office to beg him not to leave.
oh,
And he sat us all down in his office and passed out candy bars.
oh,
And
He
he
was-
later came back and taught chemistry.
did he?
But
He was an exceptional person too, a kind person. You remember the kindnesses.
Oh, I remember the mean ones too.
Oh, so do I, Donna, so do I. And I'll tell you some things when we're not on record.
Well, I remember how sweet Marguerite Hill was, but like I said, I was just always petrified of Mrs. Gillis and that ruler.
Well, she was very stern. I didn't have Mrs. Gillis, and I didn't have Marguerite, because Marguerite was younger.
she's closer to your own age.
That's right.
And could you tell us your memories of downtown Chincoteague?
Oh, downtown Chincoteague was wonderful. When I lived on Clark Street, it was only 2 blocks down. And you'd walk by, and there were trees in the yards, and people sat on their porches. And if you were thirsty, you could stop in. They'd always have a pitcher of lemonade or something for you. They knew who you were. My mother used to say, now, if you're going downtown, you behave, because if you don't, I'll know about it before you get home. And we knew that. And we always knew we could go for help. So it was very secure growing up, which unfortunately our children don't have today. I remember going to Doc Hennett's, the drugstore, and he was just wonderful. He made the best orangeades in the world, and he was always there for you. If you had a headache or something, he looked out for you. There was a lot of love and a lot of understanding. And his son became an actor. Bill went on to New York, and I think you're a good man, Charlie Brown. And my son's in Manhattan, would you believe? He worked for the same, an actor. He was involved with the same man that knew Bill and that had written You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And Neil starred in his play, The Jello is Always Red. I don't know that it went very far, but that was done in New York. So I thought it's a small world that you have a turnaround of, well, in fact, Doc Hennett's younger son, Skip, went on to New York and became involved in theater, and I think he did a lot of voiceovers.
Well, the older son, Bill, he started with No Time for Sergeants.
That's right, he did. I had
Yes,
forgotten that.
and that's where he started while he was going to college.
Bill and Skip both were in Charlie Brown.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Skip was Schroeder and Bill was Snoopy.
Oh, and we all came from Chincoteague High School and did all right. Went on to the big city and made it big. Bill has written down here my children. I have 3 children. Heather's the oldest. Heather is, I don't think she'll mind my telling her age. She's 63. She grew up here on Chincoteague. She came when she was 2nd grade and went all through high school till her senior year, and that's when we left the area for my husband's work. And she was not happy having to leave Chincoteague on her senior year. She was probably going to be valedictorian and all of us, and from a school of about, high school of maybe 30 or 40 people in her class to one of maybe 1,000 in Virginia Beach. But she did well, and it was a good thing for her, but she had such a solid, secure background right here on Chincoteague and knew that she was loved and did well in school. And then our older son, Warner, he's an attorney, he's in Northern Virginia. And then the younger son is Neil, who is in love with theater, but he's selling real estate in New York City. He's doing okay. However, about twice a year he performs with a professional group that are retired or no longer on the stage for a short time. And they produce and put on some very, very nice plays.
And your
And
granddaughter.
your grandchildren.
Oh, my grandchildren. Well, my-
Neil's children.
right now, Neil's in New York. He says his girls are living his dream. He has 2, Clara and Violet. Clara is 14, Violet is 12. I think she just turned 13. Clara will turn 15. They both go to school for the performing arts. They're both quite accomplished. Clara did Annie for the regional theater, was supposed to be one of the best in the country, in Florida, and it was outstanding. We went down to see her. The younger one, Violet, just recently auditioned and is going to appear on Picasso. Ron Howard, the producer, saw a video of her and he said, she's the one. So they flew her to Malta and she was there 10 days. She does have her SAG, so she was very well, they had to provide a tutor for her. She had to have her own private trailer so she wouldn't be involved with the older actors and actresses. And 5-star hotel on Malta with a chauffeur and a driver, 13 years old. And she just appeared on the red carpet in Manhattan with Antonio Banderas, who plays Picasso, and said he was wonderful to her. I think her part's just a small part. She plays one of his many children, I think an illegitimate daughter, with a Scandinavian, and Violet is very blonde. And I think maybe she just appears in a couple scenes, but that's quite an accomplishment for a little 13-year-old. I hope we can bring her back down to earth easily.
I'd like to go back to downtown, and if you could tell us some of the eating establishments that were there. When I was little, Gallagher's was a big thing, but
Gallagher's
on down
wasn't
the
there
street,
when I was
no.
little. No, Louise's. Louise's is, the building's gone. It's next to Dollar General, is it?
Yes, yes, and Bill Pointer's.
Bill Pointer?
But no,
Yes.
there's not a Dollar General downtown
Well, then
now.
it's Family
Right
Dollar.
at, right at the foot of the bridge, whatever that is. It used to be
It was Tall's when I
No,
was
no,
little.
no,
No, the
no,
big
on the
square.
other side, on the other
On
side.
the
Right-
other side,
right
where the
on the-
Nash dealer was,
No,
No,
Nash
right-
Dealer was on the water
where the
side.
Silco store was.
Silco.
Yes,
That's the
yes,
word.
okay. See, I go back way before. I'm trying to think.
So on the
We
corner of
couldn't wait-
Cleveland
We
Street.
couldn't wait till school was out. If we had any extra money or on weekends, we'd go to Louise's and have a tuna fish sandwich. She made the best tuna fish. That restaurant's long gone. We went to the theater right there on Main Street, which is now a mall.
The Village Mall.
What was that called? Pal Theater.
Pals.
Pal Theater. And, oh, it was so much fun. And I remember, we could walk down and walk home at night. We didn't have to be worried. Next, in part of that, there was an ice cream shop, and he also had the taxi, Daisy's Taxi. And he sold ice cream. Oh, it was the best ice cream. And where else did we go? We went down to Toll's. And
What was it before Tall's?
I think that was Watson's. It was the other Earl Watson. There were 2 Earl Watsons. We must have been related, I don't know. But Daddy changed his spelling to E-A-R-L-E instead of E-A-R-L to try to keep it straight. But the Watsons had the,
On the corner
on
by
the
the old
corner.
bridge.
But anyhow, and Bill Pointer's, because I know Bill Pointer's was there
Right.
next to Wallace's barbershop.
That's right.
And my father used to go every Saturday evening to go to barbershop, and then he'd go over there and get an oyster stew.
Oh, he made the best oyster stews in the world. And then Mr. Blake made oyster stews, and they were good.
And where was Mr. Blake's place?
What is now, is it Saigon or Vietnamese?
Right
or
in front of the theater. That little, which was originally the telegraph office.
Everett Jeffries had. For shopping, we had Keyes's, which was right next to the dime store. The Keys, and they carried a fairly good supply of everything, household items, clothing.
So you're saying that was next to
Next to
the
the-
Ben Franklin?
next to the
So
Ben
what is
Franklin, which was
now the
Lucille
Osprey
Cobb's.
Art
Osprey.
Gallery?
We called it dish rooms, and loved to go to the dime store and get all the penny candy. And then the drugstore. And then I think after that was the ABC store, which was off limits anyway. And then there was a service station,
There on the corner.
On the corner.
Of Mumford.
right.
And so when you wanted clothes and hats, where did you go?
If I could, I went to Salisbury to Benjamin's.
I mean, I very well remember going to downtown Salisbury and Benjamin's and Pocomoke to Shears.
Oh, yes, I went to
And
Shears a lot.
they seem to be the only places I remember when we would go do school shopping.
Right.
Well, there was
So-
Selby's.
But I was getting ready to say Selby's, and there was also.
Selby's had that store in the
Selby's is what was
theater.
now the annex when
Yeah.
I was a little
But
girl.
Selby's was across the street before that. Had a
And
little building.
how about the big place? Was it Wheelton's that caught fire?
That was Wilton,
The
the Wilton store.
mercantiles?
I've got pictures of all of that. You probably have them here.
Yes, we do. But that was before your time.
That was before my time.
Okay, that was before your time, certainly before my time. But the things that you remember, I also remember. So I can remember going into Hennett's pharmacy and their
yes.
little snack bar right there.
It was wonderful. He made the best orangeades.
and
Tutti
vanilla
Frutti.
zips.
Remember Mr. Odell Daisy?
Daisy.
I don't.
He was over there near where the little bakery is, the sweet bakery, on the right-hand side if you're walking from Clark Street into town.
Sugar Bakers.
Sugar bakers.
Sugar bakers.
Uh-huh.
And he made ice cones, or snow cones, we called them. And he had a special flavor called Tutti Frutti.
Supposedly, the story was that he invented that
That's what
flavor.
I heard, Bill. I was afraid to say that, but that's what I was always told, that he invented Tutti Frutti. So we used to go and get get snow cones. Oh, and there was a Pender's store. Grady Ross operated it for years, and then later he moved further down. Grocery store, but it was called Pender's.
Well, I remember Grady Ross's grocery being where the clothing store, the Funky Closet, is now.
Yes.
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay,
That'd
we're
be a
going to
good
start again, and you've just been so wonderful. I want to have you back time and time again and talk to you all day long.
My mind's going to fail one of these days. My husband says I have a computer-like brain, and I said, yes, and someday it's all going to go boing, it's all going to come spilling out.
Well, what we'd like to know is your memories of going to Assateague by boat before the bridge came in
So much fun.
1965.
So much fun. Every year we had a church picnic at the end of the Bible. We had a vacation Bible school, and at the end of the Bible school we'd have a big church picnic and take the members of the church. And I don't know who had the boat. I think Mr. Wild Maddox might have had the barge, but we'd put an awning up and they would tow us over to the beach. We went to Wallops, I believe, and have a day of it, and it was just wonderful. Also, I remember going by boat with my father, and we'd go over to Piney Island, and we'd have to traipse across, over to Assateague from Piney Island, and we'd have to traipse across to the beach.
You would walk?
Walk. And I remember one time we'd been out there almost all day, and Mother kept picking up shells, and we had so many shells, and we couldn't bring them all back, and we were like the gingerbread kids. We kept dropping shells all the way back to the shore. But there was no one there. School picnics, we would picnic over to Piney Island, probably right here, and have our picnic. Nothing fancy, but it was fun.
We
And
used to also go to the Coast Guard station. We'd sail the boat from Chincoteague and go over to the Coast Guard station.
I don't remember doing that,
You know, that's where we went.
but you did that. Yeah.
And then you walked from the Coast Guard station
Over.
down to,
I don't know why we.
there were so many shells you could hardly walk.
Well, maybe we didn't have shells, but we had a long way to go. So we didn't do too much of that, but it was a treat to go to Assateague. And then to see the bridge and see all that took place. It was
How
just-
exciting that must have
Oh,
been
it was. It
to
was
have that bridge come in.
unbelievable, Unbelievable. And to see it like it is now with the information center. And Heather worked initially over there, and it was just a wonderful experience for her.
And when I was a little girl, there were a lot of taxis in town.
Oh, yes, I was talking about Mr. Daisy. He drove a taxi. He's the one who had the ice cream parlor, or ice cream shop at the theater.
Skeets.
Skeets, I remember
Skeets taxi.
Skeets.
And Mr. Skeets. Mr. Oh, he was such a nice man. He lived over on the east side. I think he probably was the first taxi driver. But then the base was here. And so they were busy. We had a lot of sailors. We had a camp over off Ridge Road, an army camp. And I remember,
Oh, that was Camp Fletcher.
thank you, yes. And Mother, again, the entrepreneur had some rental property. We'd have military people living in it. And one couple was very nice, and they took me over to this Camp Fisher one night, and they'd have a little jukebox and play darts and whatever. And I just have fond memories of it.
Well, I can remember about 3 different taxis that would be in town, and they each had their own parking spot.
Yeah, down by Louise's.
I would say
Oh, yeah.
Fletcher was one of them, but
Fletcher Daisy
Skeet,
Skeet,
and
and
there's
Bob
another-
Williams.
there's another one that I'm not really
Skeets and
remember.
Bob
Now, I
Williams.
remember Skeets,
And-
but because I remember when my Addie and I would go over to Pony Pines for a meal, and I would get a small pizza and a dozen steamed clams.
Oh, my menu preferably. I remember going over to Pony Pines and swimming, and there was a diving board and a round, like, I don't know, like a big table in front of Pines, a little way out, and we dive off that and swim in that
It's
channel.
right in Assateague Channel.
Is it? been a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Burton
remember
Seafood.
diving board, but I can remember Aunt Addie always calling a taxi to take us over
Take you
there.
over there.
Well, a lot of people didn't have cars. That's why there were grocery stores on every corner. I mean, because people didn't have cars and the taxis were busy.
And could you touch on those little stores?
On the grocery stores, Bill's grandfather had one right out at the end of Clark Street, Tatum's. And it was a charming place, and he was such a nice man.
And is that building still there? It's
No.
apartments
No,
now?
no, that's the other grocery store. Two grocery stores side by side.
Mr. Sam Parsons, but Uncle Kenny Jester owned that. He's the one that had the big house. There's a picture up here on the corner of Clark Street. My grandmother Watson, grandmother Hill Watson, Sephora, married Elmer, and he built her the house that I grew up in. But her sister married Kenny Jester, who was very prominent in the area. I read a record of their wedding recently. It was in the Eastern Shore News. It was very interesting. But she told Uncle Kenny she wanted him to build her a house bigger than her sister's. So the house was bigger than her sister's.
And that was the Chincoteague Inn.
Yes.
Or Lighthouse Inn.
Lighthouse Inn.
Lighthouse
It's
Inn.
long been gone, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful home. Had the most beautiful staircase. But she got her big house.
I remember playing in the basement.
Do you really, Bill?
Yeah. When,
I remember spooning on the swing.
Isn't it wonderful the memories we have? Oh,
But it was one of the few houses on Chincoteague that had a basement, and they had a big furnace in there. And my friend Wayne Lee Jester,
oh, that's right.
they lived there.
That's right. It was his grandparents. Wayne
Yes,
Lee's grandparents.
it was his grandparents' house, and he had a movie projector, and we would go down there and watch Laurel and Hardy
Oh, my
and Abbott and Costello, and he had all those movies just down in the basement
Isn't that something?
because it was dark.
Mm-hmm.
They could show the movies.
Well, it seems we've had a lot of people who grew up on Clark Street. It seems like you all had a fine time on Clark
Oh,
Street.
we did. My father had a billy goat, and they used to race the billy goats up and down Clark Street, and they had little wagons. And he always wanted to win. Daddy was a great man, but he said he couldn't get his goat to outrun the other goats, and he wanted to win. So he learned that if he took a stick and tickled him under his tail, the goat would take off. So he won all the races after that.
He learned how to tickle.
The right spot. Race down Clark Street. No, I think we were very fortunate, and we were close enough to town. We were not involved in town, but we had quick access to it, which was really good.
And we could walk to the carnival.
Oh, my goodness,
When-
yes. Oh, yes.
Walk to the
And
carnival.
we always had a terrible thunderstorm on Pony Penny night. We always got wet.
We still do
Isn't that
sometimes
something?
have some terrible days on.
Yes.
I've watched many a person walk back from the carnival grounds soaking wet.
There were two seasons at Chincoteague. There was carnival season and Christmas.
Okay.
And are there any things you remember that was just real big news? When the Navy closed down, or when the Navy came in, or?
I guess when the Navy came, I remember riding the road to Chincoteague. We went around Hickman's farm.
In Horntown?
No. Right on the hill as you know where the water,
Pump house turn.
Okay,
you went straight ahead. And there was a big.
through what is now the NASA runway.
Right, and there was
Yes.
a big house up there. So I remember when it was built, and I remember the influx of the military in the area, because a lot of the young girls got married early. They married the young sailors and went off, and other names, just a whole different time. But before that, we were probably pretty clannish. Pretty much same names kept repeating.
Well, as we've talked earlier, a lot of us are related.
Oh yes.
Sometimes a couple ways we've heard.
Well, I'm related to Bill too.
Yeah,
right?
so her mother was a Booth and my grandmother was a Booth.
That's right.
And her father was a Watson and my grandfather married a Watson.
See? So I guess I'll claim him. But it's nice. I think we've enjoyed the best of times, Bill, growing up like we did. I just wish our children had the same things to look forward to. I think progress is wonderful, but sometimes we get I hate to see them punching all the buttons and not being aware of the trees and the budding and the worms and the butterflies. We're missing all of that. It's all too technical.
Can I ask what church you went to and what you
Yes.
remember about the different church communities here on the
Okay.
island?
I grew up in the Baptist church and was married at the Baptist church on Church Street. My family attended the Baptist church. My grandmother on my mother's side was Methodist. And sometimes if we were at the telephone office or at my grandmother's for dinner, I'd be at the Methodist church. But I was primarily a Baptist. When we moved, after I was married, we lived in Charlottesville for a while, and we went to a Baptist church there. But then my husband took a job at Newport News Shipyard in engineering and Newport News, and we lived in Hampton, and there was a lovely Methodist church there, and we really liked the minister, so we became Methodist. Well, he was a Methodist anyway, so I don't think the Baptist minister ever forgave me. When we came back to live at Chincoteague, my oldest child was in 2nd grade, and my husband said, "I suppose you want to go to your church this morning?" And I said, "Yes, I do. It's where I grew up." And Heather looked up at us and she said, "I don't know where you all are going, but I'm Methodist. That's where I'm going. That's where I belong." And I said, "Well, Frank, if that child knows what she is at this age, we are not going to change it. I will go to the Methodist church." So I spent my early days in the Baptist church, my later days in the Methodist church, but both were very, very good. I remember the Baptist church in particular, though. The Sunday school teachers were so dedicated. Those women were just wonderful. They didn't have a lot of education, but they were wise and taught me so many moral things that you just don't forget. And my husband's constantly amazed at me watching Jeopardy. If there's a biblical question, forget it. I know the answers. I said, "Oh my goodness, I grew up in it." And the Bible school, I remember they taught me to sew. I don't sew at all, but I can put in a hem. But we made aprons. We did, it was just a different time. And those women were so dedicated and so good.
And the boys made model boats.
That's right. And tie hangers, or things to hang ties on, or hat racks. So, and then of course, as I said, my husband was Methodist, so we went to the Methodist church, and I became active in it. And I don't think I taught Sunday school there. I taught Sunday school, where? I taught Sunday school somewhere once in my lifetime. I can't remember. But both churches were very good, and they supplied a need it was wholesome. And people were caring, and you looked out for your church community.
And so both of those churches were on Church Street?
Both were on Church Street, and both were equally good. I think Dr. Sawyer was the pastor at the Baptist church at the time when I was growing up, when he married me. And then when we came back and didn't go to his church, he was not very happy with me. He had also managed to get me a scholarship at the University of Richmond. And I think he thought that I belonged to his fold.
We all went to Reverend Dr. Sawyer to get a recommendation to go to college.
Of course you did.
Now, did he live there where the new bridge is now at the corner of Maddox?
No.
No, he
Sister
lived at
lived
the
there?
parsonage right next to the church.
That was Dr. Smith, Harold Smith,
Okay.
and he was Methodist.
Dr. Sawyer.
And he married Miss Lou Watson, who was Uncle Dave Watson's daughter, and they lived on the corner of Poplar Street, next to William, his brother, who lived on the corner of Clark Street. The churches were busy, they were full.
And what led to getting to be a founder of this museum?
It's such a thrill to be back at the museum. It's wonderful to see a dream realized. Early on, we had no idea that it would ever become what it is today. And I say I take great pride in saying that I was a part of it. At the time, I was relatively young, in my early 30s, and had a busy family. But a group of ladies approached me. I thought there were 6 initial, but might have been as many as 10, to begin a museum. We didn't know what kind, but we felt that Chincoteague needed a museum. Fortunately, we had an Italian man here who was with the Italian Space Agency, and his name was Guglielmo di Briganti. And Bill was very interested in the island. He became active in all phases of it and was named the Citizen of the Year. But his suggestion was that we start an oyster museum because Chincoteague was famous for its oysters. There had been one that he was aware of in France, and it had done very well, and he thought that would be a great way to preserve our heritage. So it was agreed that we would start an oyster museum. At first, we met in individual homes. Then finally, the fire company let us borrow one of their offices. It was on the ground level. And eventually, the oyster museum was born. We grew. We did everything possible to raise money. It seemed almost inevitable that we would ever make it. I remember making trips to St. Michael's to talk to the curators up there and how they had begun their museum. I remember appearing on the radio station in Pocomoke. I don't know if they still have one or not. A little bit timid about that, but I had an interview then. And then Mr. Daly, who was a farmer, actually an agriculturist, but he grew azaleas, and so he offered his azalea field to us after he finished selling his flowers. So we went down and dug up azaleas and potted them. He even accused us of getting in these rhododendrons, which was a no-no, but I didn't know a rhododendron from an azalea. Anyway, we sold them on the island. I don't think they flourished. We had fashion shows, we had bake sales, we did everything possible to raise money, but it was going to take forever. So it was suggested, and I don't know who arranged it, that we go to Richmond and appeal for a grant. Again, I was chairman of the committee, the youngest one around. Maybe they thought I had more energy, but I doubt that. But I was chosen to speak before the assembly in Richmond. Again, young girl from Chincoteague. I stood before all those men and I thought, you all are old. I'm young. I'm not going to be intimidated by you. I was able to tell them that we had the land donated to us. Mr. Maddox had given us a choice piece of property on Piney Island. My husband had designed some beautiful plans for a building, very modern looking, wood siding and lots of glass. And we presented these facts to the museum and just were thrilled that they gave us the grant. I cannot recall the amount of the grant. My husband seemed to think it was $25,000. It's an awful lot of money. But if it had been a matching grant, that would make sense. So I don't know the amount. But we came back thrilled. In the meantime, one or two of the ladies had talked to Mr. Maddox about getting our building constructed, and he was doing a lot of building on Piney Island. So he agreed to oversee getting a building built for us, but not the one that we had the plans for, because that was going to be too expensive. So they had to be put aside, and then we built a more modest building. But from then on, the museum flourished, it has grown, and I'm just so thrilled to see what it's become today. We left the area shortly thereafter, so I did not get to be too involved with it from the time it began. And that's just about all I can tell you. All I remember, the original people were Lucille Cobb, Catherine Talbert, Melba Tarr, Mabel Leonard. Who am I leaving out, Bill? I need my picture. Melba, oh, I know. Wilma Savage, and Mary Lou Hawkins, whose husband was a dentist, and Mildred Baker, Catherine, Earlene Young, Virginia Birch, and Mabel Leonard, and Lucille Cobb. And I think Lucille was the treasurer. I think that's...
This is a groundbreaking, 1966
let's see, the museum was 66, yes.
for the groundbreaking. The actual meetings and the idea came together in 1963.
Probably late 63 and into 64. But we accomplished a great deal in that small amount of time. Oh, going to Richmond, I sat up in the gallery and waited to be called, and I had to follow President Shannon, who was then the president of the University of Virginia, and he made an appeal for funds for the university. And here I had to stand up in front of all these people and make appeal for the museum on Chincoteague. However, at that time, I don't think there were any museums south of Salisbury, with the exception of Carr Place and Anancock. And our idea for preserving the industry and tell the history of what had happened, I think that kind of rang a good chord.
And you got the money.
We got the money. We came home happy.
And we have the museum.
That's right. And look what you've done with it. You got more money somewhere else.
Do you remember the grand opening?
No. I think I was gone by that time.
Do you remember any of the early exhibits that they've talked about or
not
planned?
really.
No.
I wish I did.
Yeah.
Earlene left town.
And I didn't have to. No one ever thought I'd leave because I'd grown up here, my family, my forefathers. We can't believe you're leaving Chincoteague. But my husband took a job elsewhere, and you go where your family is.
Did you have much support from the other communities around Chincoteague
No.
or from the county?
No.
No, just the you ladies.
Chincoteague, my mother always said that the counties were a little bit jealous of us because we always seemed to get a great deal at Chincoteague. We always achieved. We were always welcoming, had tourist industry early on, and we just kind of were cut off from the rest of the county for the most part.
Well, it seems you ladies started this sort of before the women's movement started. You were pretty brave. I don't think there were too many other women's groups that put together a museum.
Probably not, but again, Chincoteague people are a little different from a lot of other people. We're very strong. I mean, we want things done, and our women are not milquetoast. we do want to accomplish, and I had a very civic-minded mother and father, more so my mother than my father. So I had wonderful, and my grandmother had been the same. So I had, and a lot of the ladies were very involved. So it came naturally.
Well, thank you so much, and we will be calling you back when we get our event together to honor our founders.
So please edit this carefully.
Always.
But I can't say thank you
That's the
enough.
founders.
I can't say thank you enough for what the people that have now taken over the museum and called it the Museum of Chincoteague Island, which is far more appropriate. My husband said early on, you know, you're really restricting the name of that museum to an oyster museum. It's not going to appeal to everyone. But at the time, it was a unique way. It was a way of presenting it to Richmond, that we were preserving history and how we made our living. So I think it was ideal to begin with, but I'm so glad that it did branch out and encompass an altogether different area. And I can't say again, thank you for all that you've done.